The look on Sarah's face when the sheriff's deputy handed her the papers is something I'll take to my grave. It wasn't just shock. It was the total, blood-draining realization that the old man she'd been patronizing for 5 years wasn't just some senile hobbyist she could push around. She looked at me, her mouth hanging open, waiting for me to say it was a joke, a prank, a mistake. But I just sat there on my porch, sipping my coffee, and watched the reality of a $15,000 felony theft charge settle into her bones. She had spent 3 years trying to turn my own son against me, treating my home like her personal storage unit and my life's work like a pile of junk. But to understand why that moment felt like the first breath of fresh air I'd taken in a decade, I need to take you back to the beginning. I'm Arthur. I'm 67 years old, and for 40 of those years, I ran a custom cabinetry business. I wasn't a corporate shark. I was a man who knew the grain of a piece of cherry wood like the back of my hand. I built the house my kids grew up in, and I built the reputation that paid for their college. When my wife Martha passed away 6 years ago, I felt like a house with the foundation knocked out. The only thing that kept me grounded was my workshop. The centerpiece of that shop was my workbench. I didn't buy it from a catalog. I built it over the course of 2 years using old-growth European beech I'd salvaged from a specialized timber yard. It was 8 feet long, 4 inches thick, and weighed nearly 500 pounds. It had twin-screw vices that cost $1,000 alone, and a surface so flat you could use it to calibrate a laser. It wasn't just furniture. It was my sanctuary. It was where I went to remember who I was. My son Mark was always a good kid, but he married Sarah 5 years ago, and that's when the cracks started to show. Sarah is what you'd call a lifestyle influencer type. Everything has to be white, minimalist, and aesthetic. To her, my wood shavings and grease-stained floors weren't the mark of a craftsman. They were an eyesore. The first time I realized there was a problem was at Sunday dinner about 2 years ago. Sarah looked around my living room, a room filled with hand-carved bookshelves and memories, and said, "Arthur, don't you think it's time to declutter? All this heavy wood makes the house feel so small. We could get you some nice light IKEA pieces. It would be so much easier for you to clean." I laughed it right off. "Sarah, this heavy wood is what paid for the ring on your finger," I told her. I thought it was just a silly comment. That should have been my wake-up call, but I kept telling myself it was just a phase, that she was just trying to be helpful in her own misguided way. But it wasn't a phase. Over the next year, the disrespect started to pile up like sawdust on a shop floor. It started small. I'd come home from the hardware store to find my favorite armchair moved to the garage because it didn't fit the flow. Then Sarah started talking to me like I was a toddler. If I forgot a name or a date, she'd exchange a look with Mark, that pitying, he's losing it look that makes a man want to scream. The worst part was how she started treating my workshop. She began using it as a staging area for her projects. I'd go in to work on a commission and find my workbench covered in spray paint, glitter, and hot glue. "Sarah," I told her, my voice calm but firm, "this bench is a precision tool. You can't be getting paint in the dog holes or scratching the surface. Use the plastic table in the yard." She just rolled her eyes and sighed, that long, suffering sound she always made. "Dad, it's just a table. It's old and beat up anyway. I'm actually doing you a favor by using it. It makes the garage look like someone actually lives here." Mark didn't say a word. He just stared at his phone. That's when it hit me. They didn't see me as the man who built their world. They saw me as a placeholder for an inheritance. They were just waiting for me to move into a managed care facility so they could flip the house and buy a condo in the city. If that was all, I probably would have let it go. I'm a patient man. I've spent months waiting for wood to dry. I know how to wait. But then came the cruise. My sister invited me on a 10-day Alaskan cruise for her 70th birthday. I was hesitant to go, but Mark insisted. "Go, Pop," he said. "You need the break. Sarah and I will keep an eye on the place. We'll even do some deep cleaning for you as a surprise." I should have known. The word surprise coming from Sarah should have sent me straight to the lawyer right then and there, but I wanted to believe my son had my back. I spent 10 days in the cold Pacific, thinking about the projects I'd start when I got home. I pulled into my driveway on a Tuesday afternoon. The house looked the same, but something felt off. The air felt thin. I walked through the kitchen and noticed my hand-built spice rack was gone. replaced by a plastic spinning thing. My heart started to race. I ran to the garage and threw open the side door. The shop was empty. Not just cleaned, empty. My lathes, my table saw, my collection of vintage hand planes, all gone. And in the center of the room where my 8-foot beach workbench had stood for 30 years, there was nothing but a clean patch of concrete. I felt like I'd been kicked in the chest by a mule. I couldn't breathe. I called Mark. He didn't answer. I called Sarah. "Oh, hi, Arthur. How was the trip?" She chirped, her voice like nails on a chalkboard. "Sarah," I said, my voice shaking, "where is my shop? Where is my workbench?" "Oh, the surprise," she giggled. "We had a giant estate sale. Well, more of a yard sale, really. Arthur, you wouldn't believe the junk you had in there. It took us 3 days to clear it out. But look on the bright side. I've already booked a contractor to turn the garage into a yoga and wellness studio for when we move in next year. Isn't that exciting?" I gripped the phone so hard my knuckles turned white. "You sold my workbench? Who did you sell it to?" "Some guy on Facebook Marketplace," she said dismissively. "He gave me $200 for it. I put the money in a jar on your counter for your coffee fund. You're welcome." $200 for $15,000 worth of custom-milled beach and precision hardware. That bench was the soul of my home, and she'd sold it for the price of a cheap dinner. And that's when I realized they didn't see me as their father. They saw me as a bank account with a pulse. Something in me shifted that day. I didn't scream. I didn't cry. I didn't even call her back to argue. I just hung up the phone and sat down in the empty garage. I didn't say a word to them for 3 days. They thought I was pouting. They thought I'd eventually get over it, like I always did. But I wasn't pouting. I was making calls. You see, Sarah didn't know that I keep meticulous records. I have the original invoices for every board of beach, every brass screw, and every ounce of German-engineered hardware that went into that bench. I also had a professional appraisal I'd done 3 years ago for my business insurance. I spent the next 2 weeks getting everything in order. I spoke to a private investigator I knew from the old neighborhood. I didn't just want my bench back. I wanted them to understand the weight of what they'd done. They had no idea what was coming. None of them did. The investigator found the buyer within 48 hours. A guy named Rick, 3 towns over. He was a woodworker himself. When the investigator explained the situation, Rick was horrified. He'd realized the bench was worth a fortune the moment he saw it, but Sarah had been so desperate to get rid of it, he thought it was a divorce settlement or something. He agreed to hold it for me and even testify that Sarah had represented herself as the sole owner with the right to sell. Then I went to see my lawyer, an old friend named Miller. We didn't just talk about the bench, we talked about the house. You see, the house was in a living trust. Mark and Sarah had been living in a small apartment, but they'd been whispering for months about how they couldn't wait to take over the main house to save money for a down payment on their own place. I set the stage for a family dinner. I told them I wanted to talk about future arrangements and the house. Sarah was glowing. She wore her best wealthy heir outfit and brought a bottle of cheap wine. She thought this was the night I'd hand over the keys. The dinner was at my dining room table, the one I'd built, though I'm sure Sarah already had a replacement picked out in a catalog. The tension in the room was thick, but I stayed perfectly calm. I served the roast, poured the wine, and waited until Sarah started talking about her plans for the wellness studio again. "It's just going to be so much more functional, Arthur," she said, leaning in with that fake, sugary smile. "You'll be so much happier in the guest suite at the new place. No stairs to worry about." I wiped my mouth with a napkin and looked at Mark. "Mark, do you agree with this? Do you think selling my life's work for $200 was a favor?" Mark looked at his plate. "Pop, it's just stuff. We're trying to look out for your future. Sarah's right, the shop was a hazard." I nodded slowly. "I see. Well, since we're talking about the future, I have some paperwork for you both." I reached under the table and pulled out a thick manila envelope. I handed it to Sarah. Her smirk was so wide it looked like it might split her face. She tore it open, expecting a deed. Instead, she found an itemized invoice for $15,200. Underneath it was a formal demand for the return of stolen property. And underneath that, an eviction notice for the apartment they were renting from one of my commercial properties, the one they'd been living in for half rent for 3 years. The color drained from her face so fast I thought she might faint. What is this?" "That's the replacement value of the workbench you stole and sold,"
I said, my voice as steady as a heartbeat. And since you sold property that didn't belong to you, it qualifies as grand larceny in this state. I've already filed the police report. The buyer, Rick, has already given a statement. He's returning the bench to me tomorrow morning. Dad, you can't be serious, Mark stammered, his jaw dropping. You're calling the cops on your own daughter-in-law? No, I corrected him. I'm calling the cops on a thief who showed no respect for my home or my life. And as for you, Mark, since you stood by and let it happen, you're being removed as the beneficiary of the trust. This house, the business assets, the properties, they're all going into a charitable foundation for trade schools. The silence in the room was absolute. You could have heard a pin drop on the hardwood. Sarah started to stammer, her voice rising into a screech. You can't do this. We're family. It was just a table. It wasn't just a table, I said, standing up. It was 40 years of hard work. It was the thing that paid for your wedding. And most importantly, it was mine. You didn't see a man when you looked at me. You saw a hurdle. Well, consider the hurdle removed.
I walked to the door and opened it. The eviction is effective in 30 days. The invoice for the bench is due in 10. If the money isn't in my account by then, the DA told me they'll proceed with the felony charges. I think you should leave now. They tried to argue, they tried to cry, they tried to tell me I was being cruel. But I just stood there, a man who had built everything he owned with his own 2 hands, and I didn't budge. I watched them walk out to their car, Sarah sobbing and Mark looking like the world had just ended. The aftermath was quiet. I got my bench back the next day. Rick refused to take his $200 back, but I gave him a hand-carved mallet and a lesson in dovetails instead. We're actually good friends now. Mark calls every Sunday now. He doesn't ask about the house anymore. He doesn't talk about decluttering. He mostly just asks how I'm doing and if I need anything from the store. I think he's finally realized that respect isn't something you inherit. It's something you earn. As for Sarah, she's working 2 jobs to pay off that $15,000 debt. She doesn't come to the house anymore, and the garage? It's not a wellness studio. It's a workshop again. The smell of linseed oil and fresh-cut beech is back, and for the first time in years, I can finally breathe. It's funny how that works. When you finally stop letting people walk over you, you realize just how much room you have to stand tall.